My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Aimless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
Last time, Elizabeth Packard had finally gotten her day in court. At last, through her own efforts, the efforts of her friends, and her husband's predictability, cruelty, and stupidity, she had the opportunity to defend herself. She could finally prove that she was and had always been sane. Indeed, between sharing with the court the very words that had been used to label her as insane, and the testimony of a doctor/theologian who told the court her religious ideas were far from ungrounded flights of fancy, Elizabeth was finally declared sane. However, this victory was quickly spoiled when she received a letter from her good-for-nothing husband Theophilus, who had mysteriously been absent from court on that final day of the trial. As in this note he revealed that he had fled Illinois from Massachusetts and was taking their children with him. Elizabeth Packard then had at long last proved her own sanity, yet at the same time she was still denied the ability to see her beloved children. Her fight then was far from over. Yet before we get into Elizabeth's ongoing fight for justice, first, like always, I want to give credit to my sources, which primarily are Kate Moore's excellent The Woman They Could Not Silence, Barbara Sip Inslee's The Private War of Mrs. Packard, and Jeffrey L. Geller and Maxine Harris's Women of the Asylum, Voices from Behind the Wall 1840 to 1945. And like always, these and any additional sources like websites that I use in putting these episodes together will be listed on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all of that being said, let's begin. In the wake of being labeled sane yet still having her children being taken away from her, friends, attorneys, and even the Kankakee Gazette all encouraged Elizabeth to pursue a divorce. Elizabeth, though, was hesitant, as she was, after all, a deeply religious woman. That being said, she would briefly attempt to go through divorce proceedings, yet this move was opposed by Theophilus, and Elizabeth herself would eventually abandon it. You see, while divorce may have gained her some personal protection, what Elizabeth wanted was protection not just for herself, but for the many other women out there currently and in the future. The only way she saw of securing such protection then involved changing the country's laws, and in such a fight she felt it advantageous if she herself continued to act as the face of this issue, especially if she continued to be under threat of her husband. Meanwhile, Dr. McFarland and Theophilus were striking back at Elizabeth and the court through the press. Theophilus, for example, would declare the court illegal, oppressive, and a sham that had been influenced by a violent mob, something he was seemingly more than happy to assert, as whenever he read an article that favored his wife, he would write a letter to the paper in question protesting their coverage. Indeed, he would often include in his angry letters to the editor the various petitions and certificates of Elizabeth's insanity that he had been holding onto all this time. Documents which the jury had, mind you, been well aware of and still found Elizabeth to be sane. Dr. McFarland, meanwhile, despite the jury's conclusion, never for a second doubted his diagnosis, as he also steadfastly continued to insist that Elizabeth was insane. He was basically the Principal Skinner meme. He wasn't the one who was mistaken, it was the jury who were wrong. Something that he too was seemingly eager to share with the press, as he penned a letter to the Chicago Tribune, a letter which the paper notably chose to publish while refusing to publish Elizabeth's response. Something that happened time and again with multiple papers in both Illinois and Massachusetts, as publications favored both McFarland and Theophilus. This was likely at least in part because, unlike Elizabeth, both were men and one was even a doctor. Their word then, by definition, carried more weight than Elizabeth's. Plus, there was also the fact that Theophilus had a friend who gave him an in with the boss of the Chicago Tribune, thereby ensuring that the major publication would reprint McFarland and Theophilus's biased accounts, all the while not giving Elizabeth any space to respond. As illustrated in the Chicago Tribune's 12th of March 1864 edition, in which they wrote that Elizabeth, despite her, quote, almost supernatural strength of mind, she was afflicted, quote, with a well-defined species of monomania, Apparently, given everything that happened, they had to give Elizabeth some credit before declaring her unquestionably insane. That, however, did not change their ultimate conclusion, as the paper would write, due to her monomania, quote, "The public should give this painful subject no further thought." With such a campaign lined up against her, Elizabeth Packard needed a way to protect herself. She needed a way to respond to the continued attacks against her, not to mention a way to get her children back, and most pressingly, she needed a way to support herself, as again she had been left with no money of her own. The problem was, while the ongoing Civil War had in some ways allowed women to take up jobs they would have previously been kept out of, it also made sure their wages were kept extremely low. You see, with the large number of women who now had to actively seek employment, what with their husbands all fighting and dying in the conflict, employers took this opportunity to slash wages, as there was always someone desperate enough to take the job no matter how low paying. As a result, it was still incredibly difficult for women in America to support themselves. Luckily, though, Elizabeth had an idea, one partially inspired by Dr. McFarland's renewed attacks against her. She had warned him while in the asylum that she was determined to expose him one day if he failed to repent and improve the conditions in the hospital, which, between these continued attacks against her and everything she had personally experienced up until her last day in the asylum, it seemed like he had not done so. Therefore, Elizabeth decided it was time to expose him, as she had promised to do. Plus, Elizabeth was well aware that while she had personally managed to escape her husband's and McFarland's trap, there were still many women out there suffering just as much, if not worse, than she had, both in McFarland's asylum and in asylums across the country. A reality that Elizabeth was constantly bothered by and was determined to do something about. So she retrieved the various documents she had written outlining the numerous horrors she and others had witnessed in the asylum, as she desired to inform the public about the, quote, true nature and character of our insane institutions. To do so, Elizabeth looked to publish a pamphlet, in which she would note in the introduction her reasons for its creation, as she wrote, quote, knowing as I do their helpless, hopeless condition so far as justice to them is concerned, I can find no sort of rest for my liberated soul so long as my associates are not delivered also. Elizabeth had been freed, but she could not be satisfied knowing the condition so many others remained trapped in. This pamphlet then would contain hers and others' accounts of what they had seen inside the asylum, as well as a letter she had written to the Chicago Tribune under the names of her friends/allies/former cooks at the asylum, the Coes. The letter, which she had titled Appeal in Behalf of the Insane, had never been published, possibly because of the focus on the still ongoing Civil War, but she was intent on getting it published now, even if she had to do it herself. Elizabeth would also reach out to another friend, ally, and former employee at the asylum, Priscilla Homer, who was now actually Priscilla Graff, as she had remarried. Regardless, Priscilla, if you recall, was a woman who had run the asylum's sewing room, and who, like Elizabeth, had been horrified by the abuses she had witnessed while there. As such, Priscilla was more than supportive when Elizabeth asked her opinion about publishing said pamphlet. In fact, Priscilla even sent Elizabeth copies of letters she herself had sent to the trustees and to Dorothea Dix. Dix being the superintendent of Army nurses during the Civil War and well-known advocate for the mentally ill, whose lobbying helped to create the nation's first asylums. Elizabeth then included Priscilla's letters in her pamphlet, as it provided independent verification of her own accounts. To get started in this new life, writing, publishing, and fighting against the forces that had imprisoned her, Elizabeth had to first move to Chicago. Now, this was all very intimidating and quite the change of pace for Elizabeth, who had never in her life lived in a big city. Plus, just to get started, she had to borrow $10 from her friends the Hanfords, as again Elizabeth had no money of her own to start her new life with. Upon arriving in Chicago, Elizabeth quickly got to work, as she made arrangements to have 2,000 copies made of her 32-page pamphlet that was designed to expose the horrors of mental asylums in general, and the horrors of the Illinois State Hospital in Jacksonville, where she had been held in particular. Pamphlets which she would sell for 25 cents each. In doing so, Elizabeth was not only starting her campaign aimed at reforming mental asylums, but also establishing a new career for herself, as at the same time she was also making plans to self-publish her other work as well. She, though, would not start with the wide-ranging grand work that she had labored on with Dr. McFarland's blessing during her final months in the asylum. This work that she had titled The Grand Drama would not be her focus for now, as she wanted to publish the other tome she had written during that time in secret, the appropriately titled The Exposure. This tome notably also contained the secret journal that Elizabeth had kept throughout her stay in the asylum, a journal that outlined all the horrors she had personally experienced and witnessed. The book wasn't just focused on the horrors of the asylums, as it also looked to remind its readers that there were individuals in these asylums who very much did not belong there. As such, Elizabeth called attention to her own situation, as she made sure to include a copy of the statement she had delivered to the trustees and her lawyer Stephen Moore's account of her own trial. It was Elizabeth's hope then that her book would destroy the status quo and galvanize the public into forcing the government to rewrite its laws to grant increased protections for women. As lofty as her goals were, though, the hundreds of dollars it would require to publish a single volume of her work was prohibitive, and obviously well out of her extremely modest means. Still, nothing so far had been able to stop Elizabeth, and this wouldn't either. So, unable to pay for it herself, but still determined to move forward, Elizabeth essentially looked to crowdfund her book. As she started selling 50-cent tickets to people on the promise that in 3 months' time they would receive a copy. In all, Elizabeth figured to raise enough money using this method, she would need some 1,400 people to buy into her somewhat unorthodox plan. To that end, she put an ad in the Chicago Tribune that announced that the first volume of her book would be published in May, and that all those interested in purchasing a copy should send her their names. In doing so, Elizabeth then made sure to note that, quote, "Since I am left penniless by the desertion of my husband and the laws of Illinois, it would be a great favor to me should you send the money with your names, as I am entirely dependent upon this mode of raising the money to meet the expense of getting my book into print." Before closing with this note, quote, "Friends of humanity and the oppressed, I await your response to this notice." In addition to this ad, Elizabeth also started going door to door in an effort to sell both her pamphlet and her tickets to any interested parties. Now, keep in mind this was highly unusual behavior for a woman according to the standards of the day. Women were, after all, supposed to stay in the home. That was their sphere. Women then were not supposed to go out engaging with people willy-nilly in public, much less do so in relation to business matters. Indeed, a public woman was another term for prostitute, which is all to say this was a bold and risky strategy by Elizabeth that was not guaranteed to pay off and may have even potentially backfired against her, as this could have been seen as proof that perhaps she was insane after all. Still, Elizabeth was not dissuaded as she traveled from cities to towns to villages throughout Illinois, pitching strangers on her unprinted book. She'd even attempt to sell people on the idea while riding on trains in between her destinations. Now, as odd as all of this was by the standards of the day, Elizabeth still consistently experienced at least some degree of success in this work. This very likely came down to the fact that Elizabeth Packard was well-spoken, quite persuasive, and also had a dramatic story to tell about her imprisonment and her fight for freedom. A story that some might even recall reading bits and pieces about in the newspaper. Indeed, Elizabeth was able to get a wide array of people to purchase tickets for her book, as judges, soldiers, and even Mayor Sherman of Chicago would all give Elizabeth their money. Indeed, Mayor Sherman, after hearing her story, went so far as to promise that, quote, "Mrs. Packard, you shall have my protection, and I can assure you the protection of my counsel. If you get into trouble, apply to us, and we will give you all the help the laws will allow." Which was kind and all, but Elizabeth had to inform the mayor how little that actually meant given the current state of the legal system. This actually took the mayor by surprise, as he exclaimed, quote, "I must say I never before knew that anyone under our government was so utterly defenseless as you are. Your case ought to be known. Our laws changed." Now, this wasn't an entirely uncommon reaction according to Elizabeth. She found that a number of men who could not care less about women's rights, when confronted by an actual personal account, suddenly found the issues harder to dismiss callously out of hand, as they were forced to confront for the first time living, breathing proof of the vulnerability of women and of married women in particular. Because of Elizabeth and her story, the story suddenly became no longer abstract. It was actually partially because of this why Elizabeth had chosen to abandon her attempt to divorce Theophilus. She realized that by revealing to her listeners that she was still very much at risk from her husband, it only made her situation that much more real, and also put even more pressure on politicians to actually make changes to laws before something could be done to her again. It was then, thanks to all these efforts by Elizabeth herself, that by May 1864 she had successfully raised $700. This was enough money to not only have the first copies of the exposure printed, but it also allowed her to pay off all of her debts and even have some money left over. Elizabeth then had the beginnings of a successful career on her hands. Indeed, by June, a second batch of her books would be published, thanks to the fact that the initial printing had sold so well, and because with the plates for the book already made, the price of subsequent copies dropped significantly. By the end of that year, in fact, Elizabeth had reportedly sold some $3,000 worth of books, which is roughly equivalent to $60,000 worth today. And she wasn't done there either, as in January of the following year, another 6,000 copies were published for Boston and were selling quickly there as well. This success effectively gave Elizabeth her independence, as she was now able to support herself financially, which in turn allowed her to even more fully focus on the causes that she found so important. To that end, in 1866, she would publish a second book that focused purely on the rights of married women or the lack thereof, titled Marital Powers Exemplified. In this particular tome, Elizabeth looked to illuminate the injustice of the current laws concerning married women. The idea being, as Elizabeth had encountered multiple times, many did not really know just how vulnerable the laws made married women. She then hoped that as she exposed the true dangers of the system, public outrage would lead to said laws being changed. This book would at the very least prove to be another massive success, as it sold at $1 apiece, money that Elizabeth then used to fund efforts to overturn the laws that she was railing against. Her first target in this political campaign was Massachusetts, because that was where her husband had fled with their children. Plus, Massachusetts had essentially the same law that Illinois did, which allowed her to be in prison in the asylum in the first place, meaning that as long as a husband could get the consent of 2 doctors, he could have his wife institutionalized and she would be left with no legal recourse. A law that, since Theophilus was still living there and was still technically married to Elizabeth, meant that he was still a definitive risk to her continued freedom. As she got to work to see these laws changed, Elizabeth would be aided by one Samuel Edmund Sewall, the grandson of the very same Samuel Sewall who had actively apologized for his role in the Salem witch trials. Indeed, this Samuel Edmund Sewall had followed in his reformist grandfather's footsteps, as he became an abolitionist, founder of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, and supporter of the Underground Railroad. Additionally, Samuel was also deeply passionate about women's rights, as he stated that, quote, "Our society is debased because the 2 sexes do not associate as equals." As such, he had actively been trying to reform the state's laws for some time now, and so it only made sense for him to team up with Elizabeth when she began her own campaign for reform. Sewall then was a great fund of experience that Elizabeth made sure to take advantage of, while she looked to provide the spark that he had lacked, as she personally lobbied the legislature and procured the signatures required for their petition, taking advantage of her own charisma and engaging story to do so. Among the various proposals that she submitted to the government of Massachusetts was one that said that no one should be considered insane just for expressing opinions that might seem unusual to others. For, as Elizabeth argued, any reformer or person pioneering new ideas would otherwise be at risk of being labeled insane and institutionalized just like she had been. Now, this particular proposal would not be passed, but it wasn't a total loss, as on the 16th of May 1865, the Massachusetts legislature voted to amend its insanity law, making it so that the law now required that when a person was about to be committed, the person was allowed to inform 10 relatives and 2 other people, a measure meant to prevent the kind of secretive and underhanded plot that Theophilus had employed against his wife. Following this moderate success, Elizabeth then turned her attention to Illinois, where she specifically hoped to liberate a number of the women who she had been locked away with in the Illinois State Hospital in Jacksonville. Indeed, it seems that Elizabeth had never actually stopped fighting for the women she had left behind, as she had, after getting out, written to the families of the women she had known and even visited their hometowns in an effort to garner support to have them released. Then, on the 16th of February 1865, Elizabeth helped to get a new law passed in Illinois that allowed everyone, including married women, to have a jury trial before being committed, which on the surface certainly sounds like a significant victory. The problem was, as Elizabeth would soon find out, this law would oftentimes simply be ignored, because the bill establishing it had included no punishments to ensure that the law was actually enforced. Plus, it's not like the law was retroactive, meaning that the women that Elizabeth had left behind in the asylum still had no method of seeking redress or release from their captivity, which was what led Elizabeth to approach Illinois Governor Richard J. Oglesby to do something about this situation. He was, after all, a Civil War hero who had a history of fighting for minorities like Native and African Americans. The problem was, Governor Oglesby also happened to be personal friends with Dr. McFarland, Now, Elizabeth was aware of this fact, which is why she came armed to their meeting with a petition signed by 36 men, among whom were a congressman, a mayor, and some of the most prominent merchants and businessmen in Chicago. In other words, men of considerable wealth and influence who could not simply be ignored. With such backing, Governor Oglesby had little choice but to offer Elizabeth some assistance, so he introduced her to one Senator Joseph Ward, who then personally assisted Elizabeth in drafting a new personal liberty bill that would now not only require that individuals receive a jury trial before they could be institutionalized, but also entitle all current patients who had been placed in an asylum without a trial to now have such a hearing. Meanwhile, the governor would also introduce Elizabeth to the state's Judiciary Committee, who would review the draft of her bill. A committee that, when she informed them that the bill was not actually satisfactory because it did not include any form of punishment for violations, set about adding a penalty of $500 to $1,000 or 3 months to a year in prison for any doctor who admitted patients in violation of the bill. They also notably gave hospitals a 60-day deadline to grant their current patients who had not received such trials hearings to determine their sanity. This new bill that Elizabeth found satisfactory then went before the General Assembly in January 1867, a bill that notably the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Times, and the Daily Illinois State Register all supported. Dr. McFarland, however, vehemently opposed Elizabeth's bills. You see, Dr. McFarland had remained the superintendent at the asylum, and his power there remained very much virtually unquestioned. This, mind you, despite the fact that Elizabeth had been found sane by a jury, which you would think should have at least called into question the judgment of the doctor who had not only admitted her to his asylum, but who, after 3 years of having her under his care, continued to proclaim her incurably insane. Indeed, not even Elizabeth's very well-selling book that had outlined the conditions in the Jacksonville asylum had led to any repercussions for the doctor. This was basically because no one who had any authority over McFarland had any interest whatsoever in punishing, much less removing him. Indeed, in 1864, McFarland was unanimously reappointed as the superintendent of the asylum for another 10 years by the Board of Trustees, an appointment which also came with a significant raise in pay. The media, meanwhile, also seemingly had no interest in criticizing the doctor, despite the popularity of Elizabeth's tomes that were designed to expose him and the asylum. Instead, they proved themselves to be easily influenced, as they were given a carefully curated tour of the hospital before being given a substantial meal, during which they all, according to their own accounts, toasted McFarland's health, all the while smoking the Cuban cigars he had given them. McFarland firmly believed that only quote-unquote experts like himself should be the judges of someone's sanity, this ignoring the fact that McFarland had no actual education in psychology and had essentially been learning on the job. Regardless of reality, McFarland met privately with politicians, as he sought to convince them to not only reject Elizabeth's latest legislative effort, but to also repeal her earlier largely toothless bill as well. During which time, McFarland even reportedly went so far as to claim that no serious complaint of unfair commitment had ever been raised concerning his hospital. A claim that Elizabeth, when she heard of it, replied, quote, "Has the doctor forgotten that the question had been once at least seriously raised by the court at Kankakee City in the case of one whom the court decided had been falsely imprisoned for 3 years? McFarland, however, just completely refused to reconsider his position concerning Elizabeth's sanity. Indeed, if anything, he had grown even more convinced that she was mad, as he wrote, quote, "I wonder that those who so implicitly believe her story do not ask themselves whether a woman who has been truly wronged ever goes to work in this fashion for remedy. Is her course exactly a natural one? Should you, if persecuted by a husband, adopt that style of life thinking to procure a vindication for yourself?" Basically saying, as far as I can tell, that it was unnatural for a woman to stand up for herself and attempt to seek justice, meaning that Elizabeth had to be insane because she was actively trying to do something about her and other women being mistreated. Now, Elizabeth had either anticipated such complaints/accusations or was responding to them, as she framed her campaign in such a way that she was essentially asking the big brave men to come to the defense of poor helpless women like herself by changing the laws so they might be protected from nefarious characters who looked to harm them. Despite this, thanks to McFarland's efforts, the bill looked like it had very little chance of actually passing. Elizabeth, though, still had one final chance to sway the vote, when on the 12th of February 1867, she was invited to address the General Assembly, at which time she argued that all she and her law were really doing was making sure doctors like McFarland didn't have the power to unilaterally deem someone like herself insane with no questions asked. The idea of one man alone having the power to decide another person's sanity and thus their very freedom seemed quite wrong to Elizabeth, as she would state, quote, "While this law allows them to call them insane and treat them as insane without evidence of insanity, where is the justice of such a decision? You do not hang a person without proof from the accused on the actions that he is guilty of the charge which forfeits his life. So the personal liberty of married women should not be sacrificed without proof that they are insane." Essentially asking why should asylum superintendents like Dr. McFarland be free of the burden of proof that was otherwise required to take away an individual's freedom. Elizabeth even looked to use McFarland's own statements that had been aimed at her to call into question his judgment, as she read aloud the doctor's statements that had been published in the Chicago Tribune in 1864, in which he declared, quote, "I have no question but that Mrs. Packard's committal here was as justifiable as in the majority of those now here." Now, obviously, with this statement, McFarland was attempting to assert that his diagnosis of her insanity was correct. Elizabeth, however, pointed to this as being evidence that she had been far from the only woman who had been wrongly locked up in his asylum. In addition to taking on McFarland's vaunted reputation, Elizabeth also looked to make this issue personal for the politicians she was speaking to, as she asked them to, quote, "Only think of putting your own delicate, sensitive daughter through these scenes I have been put through. Do you think she would have come out unharmed? Could they be sure that some man or doctor wouldn't one day unilaterally decide that a woman they cared about needed to be placed in an asylum with no recourse? Would they really be willing to risk it given what Elizabeth had told them about her own experiences? In the end, Elizabeth's impassioned speech to the General Assembly seemed to have been quite persuasive, just not quite persuasive enough to have the law immediately passed. However, her statements had raised enough questions in the minds of the politicians in attendance that they decided they wanted to get a look at this asylum for themselves. Now, of course, McFarland and the trustees protested the very idea that an outside group had any business investigating their work. Yet, regardless of their protests, the visit still happened. Indeed, one of the committee members who undertook this investigation actually seemed to be taking some cues from Elizabeth, as he specifically asked to meet two residents of the 7th Ward that she was familiar with, Sarah Minard and Maria Chapman. Following these interviews, the committee member in question informed Elizabeth, quote, "I am more forcibly impressed with the injustice of their confinement by seeing them than from the impression I had received from you. I have no hesitancy in saying these persons ought to be removed from that asylum." Clearly then, in the opinion of this committee member, these women were completely sane and had no business being locked away in such a place. Notably, this committee member was not alone in being critical of the asylum in Jacksonville, as another would note that while he had borne witness to the, quote, "partially deranged," and the, quote, "wild, frantic maniac," during their visit, he had also encountered a number who were quite clearly sane, which only made the conditions they lived in like, quote, "wild beasts," all the more horrifying. Unfortunately, these feelings were not unanimous, as one senator would announce that the finance committee that he was in charge of was satisfied that the charges against McFarland and the asylum were without merit. Indeed, in this senator's opinion, Dr. McFarland had been, quote, "grossly misrepresented and slandered," a conclusion that the senator managed to come to despite admitting that he and the Finance Committee had not actually undertaken anything resembling a thorough investigation of the doctor or the asylum. Just one heck of a gut feeling, I guess. The thing was, Elizabeth had caused such a stir concerning the doctor and the asylum that it simply could not be ignored. As a result, T.B. Wakeman, a member of the Illinois House of Representatives, proposed the creation of a special joint committee charged with investigating the asylum and its superintendent. This committee was then given the power to question witnesses under oath, so as to discover if, quote, "any of the inmates are improperly retained in the hospital or unjustly placed there, and whether the inmates are humanely and kindly treated." Meanwhile, Elizabeth's personal liberty bill was continuing to make its way through the Illinois General Assembly. Things, however, weren't looking great for the bill, as the General Assembly's current session was coming to an end, and by the time Elizabeth's bill came up, they had already spent much of the day killing bills because they did not have the time to pass them. Indeed, her bill only came up for consideration late in the day. at which point it really looked like it might die there, as a number of these senators had seemingly not picked up on the fact that the bill was requiring jury trials for any inmates currently held in the state's asylums who wanted one. The radical nature of the bill then apparently caused quite a stir among the politicians, who apparently hadn't actually read or paid attention to it until now. A scene that understandably horrified Elizabeth, who was in attendance that day and bore witness to said proceedings. Yet despite this scene, every single senator would vote in approval of the bill. Elizabeth had done it. Every woman in Illinois, at least, regardless of marital status, would now have a chance to stand before a jury to argue for her own sanity, instead of being ushered away in secret with no recourse like Elizabeth had been. Plus, Elizabeth was confident this new law would result in a number of the friends she had made in the asylum now being released just as she had been. Elizabeth was so proud of this achievement and worried that something still might go wrong that she personally walked her bill to the Senate Speaker and to the Governor to make sure that both men affixed their signatures to it, thereby officially making it a law. With the passage of Elizabeth's personal liberty law, the state's asylums now had 60 days to organize jury trials for any patients who had been admitted without one and who now requested it. This, of course, was an alarming turn of events for the trustees at the state asylum in Jacksonville where Elizabeth had been held. They very much feared what message it would send if literally any of their current patients were found sane by these trials. Indeed, they even looked to get ahead of the story by claiming that a number of their patients had recovered thanks to their time in the asylum and the expert care of doctors like McFarland, to the point they would no longer display the commonly perceived evidence of their illness. Plus, the trustees further argued that there were others who, despite possessing so-called extreme delusions, otherwise did not present obvious symptoms, and so their illness was, quote, perceptible only to skilled observers. With their excuses seemingly already prepared, on the 2nd of May, 1867, the trials began. Yet, despite the apparent fears of the trustees that their asylum would be exposed, not a single patient who requested a trial would be found sane. This was a shocking development for Elizabeth, who knew that surely a number of the women she had met within those walls had been sane. Yet still she had the trust of the decisions of the juries, which left her only one conclusion: the torments her friends had suffered while in the asylum had driven them mad, meaning she had taken too long in saving them. Yet while Elizabeth was distressed by these events, the Jacksonville Sentinel was over the moon, as he delighted in these results, writing, quote, the reports put in circulation by Mrs. Packard charging gross mismanagement, false imprisonment, and oppression on the physicians and attendants at the hospital have been proven by strict investigation to be utter groundless, a fantasy of the diseased mind of a former patient. Yet it was more than just wasted time, as the paper insisted that, quote, these farcical trials inflict serious and positive injury on the patients. So not only was Elizabeth actually insane and a liar, but she was actively harming the patients. Now, this type of reaction was to be expected from a Jacksonville-based paper, as the entire town of Jacksonville supported and defended the asylum because the entire community relied upon the success of the institution. Yet the Jacksonville Sentinel was not alone in coming to these conclusions, as the Illinois State Register would declare the proceedings to be, quote, so manifestly farcical and absurd as to provoke only derision. The thing was, all of this had been a carefully controlled show. You see, prior to these trials, some 127 patients had been discharged from the hospital, a number that was double the normal amount of patients released during such a span of time. In fact, it seems that this process had been going on for a while. Likely as a result of Elizabeth's work and out of fear of being exposed, the trustees and Dr. McFarland had for some time been releasing more patients than they ever had before. This included one woman who had been among the first to be admitted to the asylum. In 1867, for example, the hospital had discharged 10% more patients than they had over the previous 2 years. It was in fact the highest discharge rate the hospital had ever seen. Basically, they either suddenly had a tremendous amount of success in treating their patients, or rather than risk any of their patients being found sane by the jury, McFarland and the trustees had simply released a number of patients he otherwise would have kept in the asylum indefinitely. Indeed, among those released was Elizabeth's friend Sarah Menard, one of the women the state senator had interviewed and left convinced that she did not belong in the asylum. Sarah, in fact, would conveniently be released the day before the trial started. Not knowing any of this, Elizabeth turned to her only remaining option left to help the women still held in the asylum, and that was the investigating committee that had been appointed by the state legislature. A committee that consisted of 5 men, 2 state senators and 3 representatives from the House. Leading this committee was State Senator General Allen C. Fuller, who was a prominent figure in Illinois politics. Fuller had been a judge, a Speaker of the House, and an Adjutant General during the Civil War. This committee's first meeting would be held in a hotel in Jacksonville called the Dunlap House on the 14th of May, 1867. As they got started, the committee decided there would be no press coverage of their hearings, but they would make exacting notes so that there would be a detailed record available after they were done. They also chose not to allow Dr. McFarland to be in attendance when they were conducting interviews. This was because they did not feel his presence was necessary as he wasn't on trial. Plus, they feared that his presence alone might intimidate the people they were questioning. This first session of the investigative committee would focus on the testimony of 3 individuals who were intimately familiar with the asylum. One was a former patient named Elmer Searle, while another was Elizabeth's friend Priscilla Graff, the woman who used to oversee the asylum's sewing room and who had been concerned about the abuses she had witnessed while working in the institution. While the third was a former attendant named Susan Kane, who would, while admitting to being abusive herself at times, would largely credit such behavior to being the result of working with one Mrs. Ritter. Kane would go on to describe in great detail how she and other attendants, Mrs. Ritter in particular, treated the patients, how, for example, they forbade the patients from sitting down, and how if they were caught doing so, they would be seized by their hair and lifted off their seat. Kane also explained that if the patients continued to resist, they would be shoved against a wall and choked. She even described the cold baths that had been used as a way of punishing the patients. These were, by the way, the same baths that Elizabeth recalled so vividly. The baths where sounds of struggle and gasping for air were punctuated by long passages of silence when the victims were thrust back underneath the water. Now, all of this was so common that Kane never bothered to even bring it up to Dr. McFarland because, quote, it was understood in the institution that such complaints would receive no attention. Seemingly then, others had voiced concerns about the way the patients were treated and had been ignored. Understandably, these accounts were quite alarming for the members of the investigative committee, so they continued looking into the asylum, and for their next meeting they invited Elizabeth Packard herself to come and give testimony. Elizabeth, who by this point also happened to be planning yet another book, a tome in which she planned to gather up the accounts of a number of women who had witnessed or experienced the horrors of the asylum firsthand, thereby giving the public another record of what was taking place under Dr. McFarland's watch. Addressing the committee first in the second meeting, however, would be another patient named Tirzah Shed. Tirzah was a 35-year-old mother of 3 who had been committed shortly after her youngest had been born in 1865 because she had taken an interest in spiritualism, which, as plagued by hoaxes as that movement was, as I showed in my first episode covering that subject, it was appealing to women especially because it was the one religion that embraced equal rights for them. As for her time in the asylum, Tirzah would testify that she spent about 14 weeks in there, during which time she bore witness to numerous abuses, including the aforementioned water torture with the baths. Now, obviously, Tirzah was quite disturbed by what she had seen, and could not just forget it when she was released, at which point she chose to write to Dr. McFarland, calling on him to resign because of what he had allowed to take place on his watch. Yet, instead of being shamed in any way, the doctor's only response was a short letter to her husband that read, quote, "Is Mrs. Shed becoming more insane?" continuing his trend of labeling anyone who questioned him as insane. Terza wasn't done there with her testimony, though, as she also spoke of moments much like the ones Elizabeth had experienced, where she felt that Dr. McFarland was acting improper and too intimate by the standards of the day. It was, and due to such personal accusations, that the committee decided to invite McFarland to the proceedings so that he would have the opportunity to cross-examine the witnesses and to defend himself. Which meant when it came time for Elizabeth to address the committee, Dr. McFarland would be there with a lawyer in tow. Elizabeth, who notably had no legal counsel of her own, then started telling her story. She told of how her husband had her committed simply because her religious beliefs had differed from his own, and how McFarland had accepted his accusation of insanity based almost solely on the word of her husband. She then told of how she had initially been treated fairly well in the asylum, until that is she objected to the doctor's behavior, at which point she was punished by being sent to the 8th ward where she was tormented by violent patients. She told of how she feared her life was endangered and how when she approached the doctor asking to be transferred, he callously ignored her. She also spoke on how McFarland had seen to it that she and the other patients were cut off from any contact with the outside world, and any comfort that contact might have brought. She also described the numerous abuses she had witnessed, which included patients being choked by attendants and the cruel torture of the baths. Now, when Elizabeth had started testifying, it seemed that McFarland had no fear of her or her words. He was, after all, a respected doctor and administrator, while she was, in his opinion at least, little more than an insane woman. Yet the more she talked, the good doctor was likely reminded by just how dangerous she was. Elizabeth, as I keep saying, was apparently quite charismatic and convincing when she was actually allowed to speak for herself. This was, after all, the very reason she'd been sent away in the first place. It was too dangerous for Theophilus and his allies to continue to allow her to speak and influence the Bible classes. This was also the reason why she had been banished from the 7th ward and eventually released by Dr. McFarland, as he felt it was too dangerous to have this charismatic woman around where she could influence his other patients against him. So, as she spoke, McFarland's lawyer tried his best through cross-examination to poke holes in Elizabeth's testimony and call into question her recall of events. Yet hour after hour of this questioning went on, and even as she grew tired from being on the stand for so long, Elizabeth remained unshakable as she answered all questions promptly and in well-reasoned ways. Nothing that McFarland or his legal counsel attempted did anything to damage the charismatic woman's testimony, until that is, the doctor handed his lawyer a piece of paper. A piece of paper covered in Elizabeth's own handwriting. This, you see, was the letter that Elizabeth had written to McFarland in which she had promised him her heart in exchange for getting her book published. This was Elizabeth's desperate attempt to get free and garner what she hoped to be some kind of protection from her husband. A letter which, mind you, the doctor had promised he would destroy immediately, yet here it was 4 years later, his promise clearly broken. This was as cruel of a blow that McFarland could have brought to bear. A married woman apparently offering her heart to another man, a man who was himself married, was scandalous. So scandalous, in fact, that it threatened to undo hours upon hours of unshakable testimony. Which, to be clear, is incredibly stupid. You're going to disregard everything she had said and had been through because of one note? Especially when Dr. McFarland himself had just before this testified that he attempted to make himself into a kind of surrogate husband for all of his female patients. This was his way of explaining all of his seemingly improper behavior by the standards of the time. As you see, the excessive familiarity with which he treated the patients was fine because he treated all of his female patients that way. Regardless, upon seeing how flustered Elizabeth appeared to be at this potentially damaging line of questioning, General Fuller called an end to the proceedings for the day, thereby giving her the night to prepare her response. The following day, then, Elizabeth took the stand again. As she did, she started first by apologizing for writing such a letter, explaining that she had been motivated to write it because she had felt so abandoned by her husband and even her own father, who had believed her husband's lies. It was in her desperation then that Elizabeth sought the protection of a man, something that society had told her she required. She then further laid out her circumstances in that moment by explaining, quote, Dr. McFarland had promised to publish my book, and on this hung all and every hope of my personal liberty. His bright hope seemed about to be extinguished in utter darkness by his refusal to publish it as he had promised, leaving naught for me to expect but blasted reputation and lifelong imprisonment. As my dying hope sought in vain for anything to trust in, now almost in a state of desperation, I ventured to make one more final appeal. an appeal that she soon realized was a grave mistake, as Dr. McFarland was not the type of man she hoped him to be, a fact he only further proved by keeping the letter for 4 years, despite his promise to destroy it immediately. For Elizabeth, his behavior in this matter showed McFarland to be at his core a liar, who must have lied about a great many things, as in her opinion someone who would lie to a, quote, true, pure, virtuous woman like herself would likely lie in many other facets of their life. It was at this point that General Fuller moved to help the woman he had come to see as a star witness, yet in doing so he had seemingly paid no attention to Elizabeth's testimony that morning, as it appears that he attempted to give Elizabeth an out by suggesting that she had not actually intended the letter to be a proposal of a kind of marriage. Elizabeth, however, would not follow along, stating that in her desperation that was how she meant it at the time. Not yet done, Fuller tried again, this time suggesting that perhaps Elizabeth simply had not known the doctor was married, which Elizabeth again did not go along with as she refused to perjure herself. She would not lie and say that she had not known what she had known or had not meant what she had written. She would only explain the frantic, desperate state of mind she had been in to make such a mistake. In all, Fuller's attempted assistance was a bit of a train wreck, which led Elizabeth to confront the general after she left the stand, demanding to know what he was thinking with his line of questioning, to which Fuller answered, quote, I intended to make you back down. That was my object. Elizabeth was incredulous at this, as she replied, quote, back down? General, do you gain your victories on the battlefield by backing down, or do you face the enemy with the boldness and assurance which the truth and justice of your cause inspire? I never back down on the truth. For his part, the general was apparently both surprised and impressed by this response, as he informed Elizabeth, quote, you have more boldness than any 4 women that I ever before saw combined. Regardless, while this particular aspect of Elizabeth's testimony could have gone better, it seems that General Fuller did not view the damage to be significant enough to dismiss the entirety of her testimony. In all, the investigative committee's hearings would continue on and off over the span of 7 months, during which time they would speak with 22 former employees and a number of former patients. This included Congressman John Henry, who had once worked as the asylum's steward, during which time he had witnessed 3 attendants pouring water in the face and nose of a patient from a pail. Basically, it sounds like these attendants were doing what we now know today as waterboarding. Yet, when John Henry had reported this torture to Dr. McFarland, the administrator, quote, appeared indifferent to this news, and in fact did nothing to punish those responsible, much less see that it did not happen again. Indeed, John Henry would describe McFarland as being, quote, destitute of common sympathy to the patients. In fact, it seems that many of the complaints against McFarland specifically were about how he ignored accusations of abuse and never made any move to investigate such allegations. Meanwhile, Mrs. Graff of the sewing room believed that the doctor on at least one occasion actually directed that a patient should receive the punishment, where they were repeatedly drowned in the bathtub. Then there was one attendant who testified that they had been told by 2 separate individuals of an incident where the doctor actually kicked a patient in the face, a story that the attendant had found believable considering the black eye and bruising covering half the woman in question's face. After listening to all of this and more, the investigation would finally wrap up on the 12th of November 1867. Then, the following month, on the 4th of December, General Fuller personally appeared unannounced at the asylum's trustee quarterly meeting. He was there to deliver his committee's final report. The first thing that Fuller would put out to the trustees was the sudden and suspicious uptick in patient discharges that had taken place just before the sanity trials and his own committee's investigation into the hospital were set to begin. You see, while Elizabeth had feared she had simply been too slow in acting to save the women of the asylum, the committee, upon looking closer at the hospital's records, very quickly figured out the little show they had put on by releasing all the patients who might have been found sane during the trials. The hospital had clearly hoped to put an end to any and all criticisms by demonstrating through these trials that all their patients were insane, which explains the sudden uptick in releases as they made sure to get rid of any patients likely to be found sane before they could go on trial. Patients who, mind you, they otherwise would have kept imprisoned indefinitely. Now, Fuller would admit that the committee could not prove that the patients released before the trials would have demonstrated that they were being unjustly held by the asylum. Yet, based upon the evidence at hand, they were left with little choice but to conclude that would have been the case, especially since of the 205 patients that had been admitted to the asylum since the passage of Elizabeth's first bill in 1865, 148 of them had been admitted, quote, without the proper legal evidence of their insanity. It was hard then to come to any conclusion other than the asylum was looking to hide something with their sudden uptick of releases immediately before the trials and investigation. As General Fuller read on, the report then shifted to page after page outlining the abuses and just generally cruel treatment suffered by the patients, while also finding that the asylum staff had employed the use of restraints far too often and were often guilty of misusing said tool. All of which led to the committee's conclusion that McFarland's, quote, familiarity with suffering and sorrow has apparently to some extent deadened his sensibilities and sympathies. After all, it had been documented that for years, not only had the doctor refused to take any of his patients at their word when telling him of the abuses they had suffered, but he also refused to conduct any kind of investigation to either confirm or deny these complaints. In the end, then, it was the committee's decided opinion that Dr. McFarland held too much unquestioned power, as they stated that, quote, his government of the patients is believed too severe and his discipline of attendants too mild. As a result, they would state that, quote, the committee unanimously resolved that it seemed their imperative duty to recommend an immediate change in the office of superintendent. The investigative committee had decided that the best course of action for the hospital was the removal of Dr. McFarland, a recommendation that the trustees listening to General Fuller bristled at. For them, this felt like they were being ordered to do something, firing a superintendent, which was legally a power that was supposedly reserved explicitly for them. Yet here was this upstart telling them what they had to do. On top of that outrage, much of the evidence the committee had presented came from former patients. In other words, it was coming from people whom they, like Dr. McFarland, rarely dismissed as being insane and thus completely untrustworthy. Now you may be saying it wasn't only former patients who had testified during the committee's hearings, and you're right, a number of former employees also testified, telling stories of abuses that matched up with the patients' accounts. Well, the trustees had an answer for this as well, as they saw such accounts as simply coming from disgruntled former employees who, by the way, were little more than lower-class servants who essentially had taken the opportunity to speak against their former employers. With such a mindset, instead of firing Dr. McFarland as recommended, the trustees wrote to Governor Oglesby to request that he prevent the publishing of the committee's report until they had a chance to conduct their own quote-unquote investigation, a request the governor, who was close friends with McFarland, was only too happy to grant. Indeed, the governor was, if anything, complicit, as he was known to write the doctor on behalf of other men to make sure he kept the women they sent to his asylum there for longer. Plus, quite conveniently, the governor did not actually have to order anything done. All he really had to do was essentially sit on the report until the next meeting of the General Assembly, at which point he would be required to hand it over. However, they weren't scheduled to meet for more than a year. Until that point then, for all anyone knew, that report did not exist. It seemed then that McFarland would be allowed to skate along untouched as he always had before. General Fuller, however, was not satisfied by this state of affairs, and while the doctor may have had a powerful ally in the governor, General Fuller had some friends of his own, namely he had contacts within the Chicago Tribune. As a result, on the 7th of December 1867, the citizens of Illinois woke to find the Tribune had leaked a copy of the report that they were sharing with all of their readers. Now, you may recall that Elizabeth had long believed that the public would be outraged if they ever learned the truth of what was actually happening within the walls of the asylum, and in this moment, she was seemingly proven right. Readers were shocked as they read about the number of patients committed without any formal evidence of insanity, about the extreme and widespread nature of abuses of patients, and about McFarland's apparent callousness to this situation. Suffice it to say, it was all pretty explosive stuff, so much so that the story did not stay confined to Illinois or even just the United States, as stories about McFarland and the Jacksonville Asylum appeared in papers in both London and Paris. Among those who read this report in their morning paper was Elizabeth herself. This was just more vindication, as not only did it recommend McFarland's removal, but it also revealed to her for the first time that she had not in fact been too late to save the other women in the asylum like she had believed following the sanity trials, as more than likely a number if not all the women who she had encountered and been confident of their sanity had actually been released prior to the trials so as to not embarrass the institution. Now, I would be remiss not to point out that Barbara Sapinsley's book seems to suggest that there was something political about all of this. You see, Fuller and McFarland had opposing political loyalties, which may have motivated this investigation and its conclusion as much as anything else. As such, the book suggests that at least some of the testimony wasn't quite as rock-solid as it seems. Indeed, the book would point to the trustee's own investigation that exonerated McFarland and the institution, as well as how McFarland was also supported by numerous other asylum superintendents who defended his conduct throughout. The thing is, none of that really screams innocent to me. To begin with, I'm not really going to take an institution investigating itself and finding itself blameless very seriously. By that same token, the number of other superintendents voicing their support for McFarland doesn't so much clear his name, but instead suggests they simply did not see anything wrong with what he had done, which feels like a strong indication they were just as guilty as he was of mistreating their patients or allowing them to be mistreated, while also basically taking in any and all female patients based upon the word of their husbands or male family members, regardless of their actual sanity. In other words, this problem was far more widespread than just the Illinois State Asylum in Jacksonville. For example, there was Phoebe B. Davis, who was locked up in the New York Lunatic Asylum in Utica from November 1850 to February 1853. Phoebe, much like Elizabeth and likely numerous other women, had been sent to the asylum for being a free and independent thinker. Or, as Phoebe herself would cheekily write, quote, "It is now 21 years since people found out that I was crazy, and all because I could not follow with every vulgar belief that was fashionable. I never could be led by everything and everybody, simply because they all told me their arguments were right." Once inside, Phoebe in Utica, like Elizabeth in Jacksonville, also found an environment that was, if anything, detrimental to mental health, as she would write, quote, "Most of the doctors that are employed in lunatic asylums do more to aggravate the disease than they do to cure it." Indeed, Phoebe would be horrified by what she witnessed in the Utica Asylum, writing, quote, "When I was in the asylum, I saw a concentration of evils in a condensed form." And wouldn't you know it, just like in Jacksonville, whenever Phoebe raised her voice to complain to those running the asylum about what she had seen and experienced, she was dismissed just because she was supposedly insane. Quote, "When I said anything to the doctors about the wrongs of the house, they would tell me that was my insanity. I told them that a fact was no less a fact because it was told by a crazy person." Indeed, with so much in common between the asylum in Utica and the asylum in New York, it wouldn't surprise me if one of these superintendents voicing their support for McFarland was also running this institution, as Phoebe would describe the doctors as walking, quote, "through the halls as though they thought themselves far superior to their subjects. They then seemingly felt free to treat their patients, quote, according to their capricious feelings." Phoebe also told of how many of the patients in Utica were essentially used as servants to do all the hard labor that the hospital's attendants did not want to do. Yet there was nothing the patients could say or do to stop this treatment, as in addition to being ignored because of their supposed insanity, it was also, quote, "not safe for a patient to report one of the attendants to the doctors, for they would listen to hear what the patient said to the doctors, and then they would watch their opportunities for revenge on the patients. Revenge which could take many forms, among which were similar forms of punishment as the ones Elizabeth had witnessed in Illinois. This included the use of baths to teach the patients a quote-unquote lesson, as Phoebe too recalled attendants, quote, holding them under the water just as long as they dared and more than once too. This drowning torture, of course, wasn't the limit of the cruelties, as Phoebe would also tell of how she had been punished by being forced to sleep and eat her meals in the hospital's water closet, which reeked as bad as you might expect. She also specifically recalled the treatment of another patient, a 55-year-old, tall, thin, delicate woman who ultimately died in one of the asylum's water closets, with Phoebe attributing her death to being, quote, worn out by brute-like treatment. Indeed, in Phoebe's estimation, quote, I never saw an old canal horse that was handled more roughly than that lady was being harnessed down to the bedstead. Which is all to say that I do give credence to the testimonies given to the investigative committee in Illinois that were then reprinted in the Chicago Tribune for all to read. Unfortunately, however, this was not the end of Dr. McFarland. He was, after all, a powerful white man with numerous powerful and wealthy friends. Indeed, the asylum, as previously noted, was quite important for Jacksonville's economy. Plus, the asylum in general just made a number of people quite a bit of money. These interests and McFarland's various political allies then started a campaign in the papers that directly targeted Elizabeth, as she was his and the asylum's most recognizable critic. They looked to discredit her as being, quote, notorious and crack-brained. They wanted to focus specifically on Elizabeth, so it seemed that all the claims were the result of her, quote, insane imaginings, thereby ignoring the over 800 pages of evidence that had accompanied the report. Now, it wasn't just Elizabeth's sanity that they attempted to call into question, as they also attacked her reputation by leaking her letter to Dr. McFarland, a letter which, according to the clearly biased Jacksonville Journal, exposed Elizabeth as being, quote, either insane or a bad woman, before they just explicitly came out and called her a, quote, strumpet for penning such a missive. Public opinion, however, in general does not seem to have been swayed all that much by these attacks, considering that Elizabeth's next book, titled Mrs. Packard's Prison Life, which contained the stories of 6 women who, like Elizabeth, had been institutionalized, would prove to be her most successful yet, which had to be quite infuriating for Dr. McFarland, as his reputation was continually raked over the coals in public by a woman who he remained convinced was insane. Meanwhile, the Illinois General Assembly would finally meet again in January 1869, more than a year after these revelations became public. It was at this point that they finally formally reviewed the committee's report and ordered Dr. McFarland's removal. Yet still he would not actually be removed, as the trustees, instead of firing McFarland, all chose to step down from their positions, a move that made it so there was no one who had the authority to remove him, meaning that McFarland remained in charge of the asylum until he finally voluntarily stepped down in June of 1870, a full 2.5 years after the report condemning him and recommending his removal was first published. Strangely enough, though, just prior to McFarland's resignation, much like what happened immediately before the sanity trials and the investigation, a large number of patients were suddenly released from the asylum. It was as if there were a number of patients that McFarland had been keeping locked up that he knew were unlikely to pass muster with whomever replaced him, and was setting them free now so as to save his reputation. As such, McFarland's career was allowed to continue officially unvarnished, as the now quite wealthy doctor opened his own private asylum called Oak Lawn, an asylum whose patients were primarily Native Americans who had been sent there from the newly colonized Western territories. And if you're like me, alarm bells just went off in your head as you thought, well, there's no way this can be good. And indeed, you seem to be right to be worried, as after a quick Google search, I came up with at least one book covering such an institution, so that's probably going to be an episode in and of itself down the line. Meanwhile, Elizabeth remained focused on regaining her children. In this latest flight, Elizabeth had the support of her 3 oldest boys, Theo, Isaac, and Samuel. Now, Theo and Isaac had seemingly never wavered in their support of their mother. Theo, for example, before any of this had happened, had already moved out, and Isaac had not stayed under the lone care of his father for long. Samuel, on the other hand, had wavered for a time after being told day after day by his father that Elizabeth was insane. However, after he had left home and become a lawyer following Elizabeth's legal travails, he had begun assisting his mother in crafting bills. Indeed, in March 1869, mother and son helped to pass a bill in Illinois allowing married women to keep their own earnings. Speaking of earnings, in the 5 years after being left penniless by her husband, Elizabeth now owned 2 houses and had $10,000 in the bank. It was then with this income and the support of her 3 eldest children that she went to Boston seeking custody of the rest. Theophilus, meanwhile, in contrast to his wife's success, had not had steady work as a pastor since 1865. However, he remained as bitter and petulant as ever as he attempted to launch an attack against his wife through the press, claiming that her successful career as a writer was proof of her monomania. This time around, however, Elizabeth would not be alone in her fight, as in addition to the support of her 3 eldest children, she was also joined by her old ally Samuel Sewall, who she had worked with in amending Massachusetts' insanity laws. Indeed, Sewall would bring news to Elizabeth that there was currently a law being considered in Massachusetts that would allow married women to become the legal guardians of their children. Now, to be clear, unlike her husband, Elizabeth was not seeking sole custody, thereby denying their father the right to see and raise his children. All Elizabeth wanted was mothers to have equal parental rights. Yet still Theophilus resisted, as he had his lawyer push the hearing for their case back until later in the year. That lawyer, however, apparently made it clear to the former pastor how little chance he had of winning. So in May 1869, a month before the trial was set to take place, Elizabeth unexpectedly received a note from her children that read, quote, "We will gladly accept your offer to go out and live with you in Chicago." Elizabeth finally had her children back, although she had been robbed of being involved in their lives for something like 9 years, as little baby Arthur was now 10, while George was 15 and Libby was now 19. Still, they all moved out to Elizabeth's home in Chicago, where they joined not only her but their 3 eldest siblings, and all living under the same roof once again. Elizabeth had finally won. She was free and she had her children back. That being said, they would only live under the same roof for 3 years before the children began to depart either for work or for marriages. The most painful of these departures involved her youngest Arthur, who would opt to go work on a farm to be closer to his father, who he was obviously closer with in general, as he had been essentially raised by Theophilus alone due to Elizabeth being prevented from being there for most of his formative years. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was still far from done with her fight to make the world a better place, as over the next 3 decades, she would continue to work to pass more laws across the country as a part of her fight for women's rights and the rights of the mentally ill. Indeed, by her own count, Elizabeth would successfully help to pass some 34 bills across 24 states. As an example of this success, in 1880, Elizabeth would receive a gold pocket watch bearing an engraving that read it was from the grateful quote, "Married women of Oregon for securing their emancipation." Among her various victories, Elizabeth helped to establish independent bodies tasked with inspecting asylums, bodies that notably had the power to overrule even the asylum's trustees. She, through her laws, also helped to guarantee that patients had the right to send and receive their mail uncensored by administrators, in the hopes that this would help to ensure patients would not be mistreated because they would be able to freely communicate these experiences with others outside the asylum's walls. Now, Elizabeth would not be alone in this fight, as the laws that she directly helped to pass also inspired the passage of similar laws in other states that oftentimes bore her name, as they came to be known as Packard's Laws. Meanwhile, in 1880, the National Association for the Protection of the Insane and the Prevention of Insanity was founded, an organization whose existence was partially inspired by Elizabeth and other reformers like her. Yet, while Samuel would carry on in his mother's reformist footsteps, using his skills as a lawyer to continue getting laws designed to aid others passed, not all her children would be so lucky. Namely, Elizabeth's only daughter Libby would struggle with her own mental health for the rest of her life. Now, I can't say with any certainty that Libby's mental illness, whatever it may have been, was a result of the traumatic loss of her mother when she was 10, and then subsequently being forced into taking over all the chores of the house, including cooking and cleaning for an entire family. What I will say, though, is all of that probably did not help. The loss of her mother's care, the constant lies that her mother was insane even though Libby herself had never seen any evidence of it, combined with the constant stress of having all that responsibility foisted upon her at such a young age, certainly could not have done her any good. Indeed, subsequent generations of the family reportedly attribute Libby's multiple breakdowns over the years to the pressure she had been placed under as a child. In fact, modern studies have suggested that children who are suddenly deprived of their mother for prolonged stretches can experience a kind and level of stress that can disrupt their, quote, ability to regulate their emotions and cope with future stress, which does sound like it could fit in with the accounts of her having mental breakdowns from time to time. If she was put under stress and just could not deal with it because of the damage that had been done to her as a child, it does make sense. Now, Elizabeth would do what she could for her daughter, which included staying at home for 3 years during a stretch when Libby was particularly ill. She even came to her daughter's rescue when the man Libby married had her institutionalized in California, because even though Libby, unlike Elizabeth, actually seemed to be ill, Elizabeth simply could not stand the thought of her daughter being held in such a place after everything she had personally experienced. So she brought Libby home and cared for her personally. Libby sadly would suffer periodic breakdowns throughout her life, as she vacillated between good periods and bad, before ultimately dying in an asylum at age 51, as that's where she ended up following Elizabeth's death in 1897, who had died at age 81, her grave reading simply, Mother. Now, Elizabeth was far from alone in being unjustly locked away, and the asylum in Jacksonville that she had been sent to was far from unique. Indeed, one Lydia A. Smith, who was locked away in an asylum from 1865 to 1871, would write, quote, "It is a very fashionable and easy thing now to make a person out to be insane. If a man tires of his wife and is befooled after some other woman, it is not a very difficult matter to get her in an institution of this kind." Men who wanted to get rid of their wives rather than divorce them, which had negative religious connotations and wasn't always easy to accomplish legally, could simply have them institutionalized. It was a solution to the problem of a wife who, like Elizabeth, dared to speak her mind, or one like Lydia speaks of, where the man tired of his wife and wanted to pursue another woman. The system was, after all, essentially set up to make this possible. As I've pointed out, husbands had almost total control over their wives, and often had loopholes carved out in the laws that were designed to prevent someone from being institutionalized without evidence. Plus, it was a socially acceptable explanation, as women were supposedly more vulnerable to insanity than men. In addition to their more emotional nature, it was also claimed that the strain of raising children and maintaining a clean and orderly home could cause insanity. Additionally, women's bodies were also frequently listed as sources of insanity, with menstruation, giving birth, and lactating all being named as causes of insanity. It wasn't just married women either, as institutionalization was often a way of just putting troublesome women out of sight and out of mind. For example, Adriana P. Brinkle would be locked up in the state hospital for the insane in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania for 28 years, from July 1857 to the summer of 1885. Adriana's mother had died when she was young, while her father, a physician and one of the 2 men who would eventually have her committed, was not home very often. This lack of parental supervision may have helped to lead to her reputation as being a bit unruly. The main reason why Adriana would be sent away, however, was because she had purchased furniture for her small apartment partially on credit. However, she would soon enough move out of said living quarters to a larger space that came fully furnished. Not needing the furniture in question anymore, then Adriana moved to sell it, even though she had not yet paid it off, for which the shop she had originally gotten the furniture from had her prosecuted. Now, this wouldn't have been that big of a deal at most times, as Adriana's family was fairly well off. However, this particular moment in time coincided with a bit of an economic downturn that had negatively impacted her family's fortunes, which meant that neither her father nor her uncle could afford to pay her debts at the moment. Yet, rather than reveal this bit of familial shame to the world, her father, as a physician, moved to have her committed, thereby preserving the family honor. Now, initially, Adriana would be placed in the best ward in the asylum, but even there, the true nature of the institution became obvious to her, as she recognized that the, quote, "untrained nurses in a hospital for the insane know no more about treating insane people than I know about prescribing for a case of fever." In other words, this asylum in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, suffered from much the same woes as the one in Jacksonville, Illinois. Abuse, for example, was as rampant here as it was in Jacksonville, as Adriana would write, quote, "I saw a harmless patient who was sitting listlessly on a heating register attacked and beaten because she would not work. One nurse knocked her down and then called another with homicidal mania to join, and they pounded the unfortunate creature until she was black and blue." Such behavior was, in Adriana's opinion, the result of the simple fact that the, quote, "ex-laundry woman or factory girl who becomes a nurse cannot understand such a problem as the mind, and when the patient is refractory, she can only meet it with brutality. That is wrong. Those who are deprived of reason cannot understand violence, nor has it any good effect on them." As for the man responsible for putting her in this place, Adriana's father would not visit her at all during her first year in the asylum. Then, when he finally did show up, it was to mainly inform her that she would have to wait until the troubles about her debts blew over. However, that apparently did not happen in the next 4 years, by which point her father died without ever visiting her again. With her father's passing, Adriana then had no one who could get her out of there, as all legal forms had been followed in having her placed there, meaning Adriana was now left with no real recourse of getting out of the asylum despite actually being sane. It would not be until a new law concerning the insane was passed in 1883 that Adriana finally had the opportunity to be examined by a fresh set of doctors from outside the asylum who readily agreed that she was sane. Adriana P. Bringle then it seems had likely been saved if not directly as a result of Elizabeth's work, then as a result of a law that had likely been inspired by her campaign of reform. Yet, even though Elizabeth had fought to pass laws to prevent other women from being unjustly locked away, some still managed to fall through the cracks. For example, Alice P. Bingham Russell would be kidnapped by a sheriff under orders from her husband in 1883 with the intention of having her locked away in an asylum. Alice, however, would escape that fate as a result of an insanity trial. However, the very fact that such a trial had taken place only made it easier for her husband to try again later in 1903 with better so-called evidence, as now he could point to the fact that she had faced such a trial before as a sign that she was disturbed. Alice's imprisonment then shows that even with the protections Elizabeth had fought to put in place, women were still vulnerable. As Alice would write, institutionalization was still very much a weapon that could be wielded against those, especially women, that others considered inconvenient and troublesome, as she would later write a warning quote, "Can you not recall times in your life when you have done or said things that others with a motive to deprive a person of their freedom might have committed you to the asylum, perhaps for life? For there is no limitations on being adjudged insane, nor is there a higher court to appeal to or a society." Alice, for example, told of a woman who, after arguing with her husband, left their home. This woman then got a job as a janitor so as to support herself, all the while hoping that her absence would prove her worth to her husband. Now, after some time away, this woman would return to her old home, simply to retrieve some of her clothing. However, she would be refused entrance to do so. It was at this point that the woman, in a bit of a petty move, took some of the clothes hanging on the clothesline out back. Clothes which belonged to both her husband and to the woman who was now living there as a housekeeper. For this, the wife would be arrested, but instead of simply being forced to return the clothes, or even being jailed for a time as prescribed by the law, she was instead sent away to an insane asylum indefinitely. Alice would also tell of another case of a woman whose husband had abandoned both her and their kids. However, when she demanded that he fulfill his obligation to support them, she was sent away to an asylum. Then there was the case of a Norwegian preacher who had his wife committed to an asylum because he had fallen in love with a schoolmarm. And there was also the case of the woman who, after suffering a stroke of paralysis, was committed by her husband who wanted to marry the housekeeper he had hired after his wife had fallen ill. In addition to showing that women were still very much vulnerable to being sent away by uncaring husbands who wanted them out of the way, Alice's account also showed how little things had changed within the asylums as well, as she would describe how the doctors in 1903 were still able to operate with little oversight. No one, it seems, actually bothered to check and see if the reports were accurate. Meanwhile, most accusations of impropriety by the asylum staff were still ignored. Now, as time has passed, cases like Elizabeth's and the others, seemingly at least, have become less common, although I doubt they're completely unheard of even today. Meanwhile, abuse of patients has seemingly never gone away, due to the fact that they are locked in an environment based on the extreme power imbalance between patients and those supposedly caring for them. Plus, the social stigma connected with such patients still leads to distrust of any complaints they make even today. Finally, before we leave, I want to briefly touch on the Britney Spears conservatorship case that I couldn't help but be reminded of when researching this case. Now, conservatorship is supposed to be a legal means of assisting the elderly or differently abled. It's supposed to be a way where someone can deal with health or financial matters on their behalf. Whether they are incapable of handling such matters themselves or are considered to be unable to resist fraud or undue influence, the idea is such individuals are assigned a conservator to handle such decisions. Now, the Britney Spears case started in January 2008, when she was admitted to the UCLA Medical Center on a psychiatric hold following an incident of police intervention concerning a child custody dispute. The police believed her to be under the influence of something at the time, and they also cited recent incidents like shaving her head and attacking a paparazzi with an umbrella as being reasons for the psychiatric hold. Now, regardless of how justified or not this initial hold was, it likely would not have been a big deal had her father Jamie the following day not petitioned the court to be made her conservator. In doing so, he was granted a whole array of powers in controlling his daughter's life, including restricting visitors. Visitors which included attorneys who might be able to challenge his appointment as conservator. Indeed, one attorney she attempted to hire for this purpose would essentially be fired by her father a few days after this initial incident, with the court essentially deciding that Brittany did not have the capacity to hire a lawyer to defend herself against what she characterized as, quote, nothing more than a hostile takeover. This wasn't a one-time thing either, as apparently another lawyer who Brittany attempted to hire to represent her against her father would be given a restraining order by her father. All this happened quite rapidly, and effectively cut her off from any legal representation that she herself might desire. Additionally, this whole thing was highly unusual, seeing as how Brittany had established a trust that was supposed to handle all such issues in case she was incapacitated in some way. Basically, her father was simply allowed to sweep in and overrule the trust that Brittany herself had created for exactly the kind of circumstances that they claimed were taking place. Additionally, as the years went by, even though she supposedly remained incapable of handling her own finances and business concerns, she was at the same time well enough to fulfill any number of professional commitments, including numerous performances. This was because her father reportedly got a cut of seemingly just about everything she did, meaning he regularly profited off of all aspects of her business, meaning that the man who was supposed to be looking out for her best interest was regularly in a situation where such concerns conflicted with the profits he was personally in position to benefit from every time she performed. It's been asserted then that she had with some regularity been forced to perform against her will, with the threat of punishment if she failed to do so, as it's believed that she at one point was placed in a mental health facility as a punishment for standing up for herself during a rehearsal. These forced performances allegedly included one time when she had a 104-degree fever. Additionally, Brittany would also be forced to take lithium against her will, while also being prevented from having her IUD removed. Understandably then, Brittany would claim to have not trusted and even actively feared her father throughout this time, a situation that lasted for 14 years before the conservatorship was finally ended. So even today it seems that a rich and powerful woman in the public eye might still be labeled as mad and put under the thumb of a man in her life. Like in Elizabeth's case though, there does seem to be a push to prevent such situations from happening again, as in the wake of this case, California in 2020 passed new laws to reform the state's conservatorship system. Now conservatorship is only to be used as a last resort, after evidence is provided to the court showing the failure of less restrictive methods. The new laws are also designed to make it easier to end conservatorships and to ensure that individuals in such situations are fully informed about their rights and what recourse they have. In addition to California, similar bills have been proposed on a national level, although I am unclear if anything has actually been passed or not. Among the reforms that have been suggested are things like the conservatee having the ability to ask the court to replace their conservator with someone else chosen by the government, while the National Council on Disability has proposed ways of ensuring that those facing such a situation are fully informed of their rights on how to avoid a conservatorship and how they might go about ending one. They also suggest that individuals facing such a situation be granted access to lawyers paid for by the government to help them with their situation. As is so often the case then, things have seemingly not changed quite as much as we would have liked, but there are still people out there trying to do the right thing and make things better.
Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you're feeling especially generous and would like to help keep this podcast going, please consider visiting my Ko-fi page at ko-fi.com/distortedhistory and donating a few bucks. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. I will be posting updates on future episodes and sources there in addition to posting them on Twitter as I usually do. With all that being said, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.